It's obviously been a big issue with them, the Conservative Party, ever since we joined the community or whatever it was called in the 70s, I believe.
It was actually before it became, it dominated the Tories from the 90s onwards, but before that, it was an issue with Labour. What people were saying with Corbyn is that for some of the last Labour's manifesto, if they would have been going against current EU law in regards to some of the policies. So it's just a way of explaining why he's not so much subtly pro-Brexit now, but he was.
I suppose more recently, with the rise of UKIP, say from the middle of the noughties, kind of scared the shit out of Cameron a little bit. So I think that was the point in which it became a top agenda kind of issue.
Because Cameron's really to blame for everything. I mean, he was catering to, I guess, what he perceived to be a minority, but a minority that obviously gained traction very, very quickly. And in the case of Brexit, thundered into a majority. But he must have done that only on the basis of thinking there's no way that they're actually going to vote to leave the EU.
I remember the campaign. The campaign in Scotland was, I don't want to say non-existent. It wasn't non-existent, but it was certainly a bit blasé. Nobody seemed to be that invested in it because of that assumption that it was going to be a Remain victory.
And I think even the Remain campaign down south, I think that was a major problem for it, was this kind of default assumption that there's no way Leave are going to win. I mean, Leave were fucking passionate. I mean, they were out there talking their utter bollocks, but they were doing it with a great deal of welly and really, going for it.
The issue with Brexit is that the UK is not really used to referendum, whereas like in the Republic of Ireland, they have them all the time, and it's sometimes mocked that they might have a few on the same subject. That's how they work, though. That's the process. The first one is kind of like, it's what ours should have been, which is an advisory one. And then you kind of go away and you're like, oh, here's like, okay, we've taken that on board. We've actually went and did a lot more work. Here's what's actually going to happen. So you should be, there should be stages, but ours has just turned into this, like the will of the people.
Not in David Cameron's world.
Yeah.
Do you think that should be the format then? Like for any?
I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying where other referendum happen, that's kind of generally the consensus. Whereas everyone went into it a bit. I think the Remain went into it very, as we said, very blasé, and therefore put in a half-hearted attempt when they should have maybe actually put a bit more work into what the reality was going to be. But like the whole campaign, there was nothing there. There was no substance to it. It's like, do you want to leave the EU? Whereas at least in Scotland, we had white papers and actual discussions, and like it was like a longer process. There was still a lot of work to do, but at least there was something there,
2 years to do the work, at least in the first instance.
Of course, people bash the white paper all the time, and some of the criticism might be valid, but at least we had one.
The best thing about the white paper was the first half of it was the white paper, and if your attention span wasn't quite all there, the second half was the white paper again, but as a question and answer. I love that.
If we're saying that, referendums are imperfect because, obviously the electorate are stupid, which, I think it's a fair point. But at the same time, we believe in their right to make decisions and, change things. So what's the perfect way of doing that then? Should we have kind of a cut-off where you have to get 65% to win? Or do you have like 2 referendums in a row over like 2 years? Or like, how do you, because that's 2 like competing things there. The fact that you need to have, for a fact that this is really the decision of the people for a long-term choice, a constitutional change. But at the same time, you want to give them that opportunity to make that choice.
I think they have to let it happen. Yeah, the electorate are idiots, but they voted for what they voted for. And I think Brexit has to occur. And I think after so many years of that being in place, they can then vote to rejoin, and that's it. Because then you can go, we voted for this, we've lived with it, we've got the consequences, and now we go again. That's, I think, how that has to work. You have to accept there has to be surely a 5-year period of accepting the vote, living with the consequences, and then changing.
I used to think like that, and I did think post-Brexit, I was like, well, that was the referendum. That's just the way it is. The way it's played out, I think there's enough of an argument for it's not going to happen because the Tories are like determined to see it through. If the whole of the Parliament was like, listen, okay, we've taken it on board, it's much more complicated. We need to have another referendum to confirm it. Here's here's detailed what's going to happen. To me, that's not subverting democracy at all.
How does it fit into the idea of self-determination? So you're talking here about, we're going to run the referendum again because now we're going to have more information and more of this, more of that. But is it really going to change people who think on a fundamental principle basis that our organisation in Europe should have fuck all to do with what Britain does internally?
I think this is why Brexit is a nightmare. The main vote seemed to have been about immigration, and the continued will to leave is about immigration, even though that doesn't really have much to do. And most of the issues people had, they could have done that while still being in the EU.
The vote to leave was not a vote to leave the EU, it was a vote for immigrants to leave the UK.
I think it is all just immigration. It's just this, they want their country back, and you're like, from what are you talking about? And I think as you go deeper, it's the result of they all live in these deprived areas of 30 years that are rotting away, and they get a chance to vote on something that means it, and they're like, yeah, fuck it.
Is Brexit like the ultimate legacy of the Tory party? Because you're talking about these deprived areas, poverty, being you're saying those are the things that are driving this. So is the Tories' ultimate legacy that by creating a nation of extreme poverty and nationalism being connected with that, and then thrusting a Brexit vote, is this all kind of just to do with that idea that by basically a Tory government raising a nation of arguably poorly educated people with not an awful lot of upward mobility due to the setup that they have created? Is this all an inevitable consequence of their governmental decisions, and therefore David Cameron's a fucking idiot for putting the vote out in the first place because he should have known better?
It's all the Tories.
Can I be controversial for a second?
Right, do it.
And defend David Cameron. Because you're right in what you're saying, like he was the actual guy who was in charge who decided that yes, these referendums can go ahead. Well, how much of it was actually his decision and like folk who are behind them? It's kind of hard to know, but the concessions he got when he went to the EU and he tried to bargain with them to say like, my country seems like it's, a lot of people want to leave the EU and it's like quite a crisis. Can you give us any kind of concessions here? And it's actually not that bad if, in retrospect, you look at what he got. I think it was something like a 6-year kind of moratorium and, people coming from the EU before they were able to get benefits and stuff like that. And that's, these things are probably now looking back on it, you think actually what you got was actually pretty decent and should have been enough to actually salvage it.
Is that not a failure then of the Remain campaign not to play up? To basically say, look how we have the best deal in the EU.
Can actually get concessions.
Yeah, we have the best possible deal out of every country, and it's actually not bad.
It comes back to a point I made in the previous podcast. What you've just said there, on that occasion, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, who is a Tory, went to the EU and did the right job. He got some concessions. For the Remain campaign, who are mainly lefties, like SNP people, we actually have to admit that David Cameron, a Tory, did an okay job. And we ain't fucking doing that. And I think one of the problems the Remain campaign had was, how do you do a Remain campaign where you're having to buddy up with Tories? Because a lot of the Tories, including the present Prime Minister Theresa May, were Remain voters. So how do you make that work?
Well, yeah, I don't know. Like in Scotland was separate enough that the SNP could kind of lead it, even though there were all the other parties. So they weren't necessarily linking with English Remain. I guess Corbyn has been criticised that he wasn't energetic enough in the Remain campaign, which at the time I thought was harsh, but looking at how good he was electioneering for the election, I think
he was a complete ghost.
Yes, I think that's become a fair criticism now in retrospect.
He submarined, he went under and then popped back up for that general election. That's what he did.
Did you know?
Effort.
Because we were praising Cameron there, but at the end of the day, he fucking lost it. So there's nothing to praise about.
I think we're saying, you're right, but I think what we're saying is that in that isolated incident, he did something that was good. And that could have been something the Remain campaign, the Labour end of it, the SNP end of it, could have said, the Prime Minister went to Brussels, he has proven that you can get concessions, and therefore we do have more control over this situation than those lying fucks in the Leave campaign would have you believe. But the concessions, they're not going to do that. They're not going to say that.
Just based on this, the concessions, what was it, a moratorium on people coming from the EU and not getting benefits? That to me is still kind of a bit dodgy. I don't like that. I don't like where that comes from ideologically.
Well, yeah, our message in Scotland or the SNPs wouldn't have been, look at all the concessions we get. We actually like the EU and being European. That was the way we promoted it.
At what point should people have been standing up and saying, okay, yes, he's a pig fucker, but he went over there and now this guy from Poland won't get any benefits for 6 years. So that's that.
Problem, the Remain campaign's argument was basically to ignore the Leave campaign's argument. So if you go up against Leave people that are saying, like, we want to take back control was their slogan, a perfect example of actually being able to do that to an extent was what David Cameron did. Their whole drive was, we're being ignored, we don't have control, we're being dismissed. And the drive of the Remain campaign was to dismiss them and go, you're fucking idiots. And the EU is actually amazing. If you read about it, it's really, really good. And that was all we really did. There was never any attempt to not to validate, but to engage with, sympathising with what some working class guys were saying about the EU.
How, like, really, if it comes down to people not liking the brown immigrants in the street, how can you actually engage with that? You're not going to be able to debate with them.
That's a really good point.
They're just going to be like, no, I fucking want them out.
I don't have a comeback to that.
Yeah.
There's no comeback to that.
Which is maybe, you could maybe argue Corbyn and Labour, who are traditionally from those areas, maybe should be more engaging. It seems to be, anyway, in Scotland, the areas that, benefited from all the EU projects, like, they seem to go, yeah, we benefited from the EU money. But there's places in Wales who, like, voted to leave, who benefited more, but they can't see past, like, I don't know, I'm looking at probably their own racism to see that they're harming their own community for what they think is going to improve it. Or I don't know.
Did you think we were going to vote Leave? Did you? What point did you do what Cameron did and assume we were going to vote Remain?
I always thought we would have voted Remain, but as far back as the run up to the Scottish referendum, I remember talking to people and saying, almost preempting it, because I knew the Tories had the EU referendum in mind, and talking to English friends were laughing at me. They were laughing at the prospect of us voting to leave the EU. And they were from London, but you're kind of going, oh no, I think England, at the time, I think England kind of could vote to leave. I didn't think as a UK as a whole we would. The day I always like stick my political bets on, that night I put 20 quid on at the last minute, and it was like it'd all been, the exit polls showed 52% Remain, and I got ridiculously good odds. Remember Farage went on TV, the exit poll, and he was like, it looks like Remain's going to win 52%. We will never let this lie. We will have a second referendum and we will keep going. And then the next morning he's on like Good Morning Britain or whatever, and he's like, no, that's the result. The people have voted. And it's like, 4 hours ago you were giving some talk. He's like, nah, that wasn't me.
It ties into a lot of like almost Donald Trump stuff. Have you read Fire and Fury? Yeah.
No.
Oh God, it's fucking good. But that was the thing about the Trump election too, that he went into that as a business move to launch Trump TV network. That essentially the whole campaign, the battle plan was to get him as close to the end, but the working assumption was, of course, Hillary's going to win. So they wanted to basically come second and then make years of TV network programming off the back of like, we are the great rebellion against, the status quo. And then they fucking won by a mistake. And Farage, Fire and Fury, just please buy the book, read it, it's amazing. But like the Farage thing is very similar, that I think that this alt-right is kind of like a money spinner for a lot of these people. And I think that what happened was everyone assumed we're going to vote Remain. And then this thing caught in a way they weren't expecting.
You could see it on the faces of Boris Johnson and Michael Gove when they gave that talk. They were shocked, you could tell, and they didn't know what to say. They didn't expect to win at all.
Do you think if we're going to apportion blame, for like rights or whatever, do you not think the EU should, shoulder a lot of that? Because it's hardly a blameless institution. There's like a lot of things that are wrong with it.
I think it's hard to blame the EU in that they've kind of like catered to the UK for so long and given them, but they weren't a complete like brick wall. They were kind of like, come on, here's a wee this, here's a wee that, and they've got to work as a whole big unit, so you can't,
But maybe that's the problem, though.
No, yeah, that's
maybe that's.
Well, I was going to bring it up earlier, but I'll stick it in now. What I think's the worst thing now is it's going to be such an economic fucking disaster. If, say, that wasn't so guaranteed, what's the big? Would people care as much?
I think that there's two ways to look at it. It's the economic level, which is obviously shite, and it's going to hurt. I think, though, that it's also a statement of, I do see it as a regressive step.
Yeah.
I see it as the way it's been framed is you either have to be part of this imperfect group of nations or it's flag humping, border, whatever. And I think I like humans working together in global cooperation. I like all that stuff, and that's what I want to see us move towards. And I think the Brexit thing represents the Steve Bannon view of the world, which is very much like, we're not designed to do that. We must stay in our borders.
Yeah.
And that really horrible, isolationist, humans from different parts of the world should not interact or merge with other people.
It's this kind of British insular nationalism of an older generation that's like stealing it from the youth and all these opportunities.
The vote for me was, it wasn't about going, yay, the EU's great. For me, it was always framed of what's the choice? Because if it's a choice between an imperfect EU superstate or Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson running the UK, I'm all for that fucking superstate, man. Sign me the fuck up. It was always, out of the two scenarios, I viewed the EU superstate as being like the far lesser of the two evils.
It feels like that's the same in a lot of elections these days, that people don't generally get really enthusiastic about one side or the other. They're just voting against the alternative. It's like, oh, Farage, no way, man. Or like, Trump, and then they look at Hillary,
it's risk.
It's like reactionary. It's voting against the thing that you don't want rather than being in favour of something that's good. Because, I don't think the EU is good. I don't think not having the EU is good either. Both of these circumstances have like things about them that are garbage.
I don't know. I still think the idea of nations working together. I mean, the EU has kept the peace in Europe since World War II. That I don't think can be disputed. I think that is a good thing.
I mean, every country will have their wee niggles about the EU, but it's all weighing it up to see what the greater good is.
What is the alternative?
I don't think there's a perfect alternative that's like available just now. I mean, I would have preferred them to go like the EFTA route, where it's more like what their EU was originally meant to be, which is just like a free trade area, and it's not like a super state. I don't think I think we've kind of played down a lot of what people in the EU actually want, which is to create a kind of a United States of Europe. That is quite a serious thing. That's a lot of the people who are really in power are talking about. And we kind of like slag off kind of UKIPper type folk for like thinking that that's a reality, but it actually is. That they do want a more integrated kind of system. They've got their own currency. They would rather we've been part of that.
Would you not think a global currency would be a logical step eventually for the human race?
Yeah, non-state currency would be good.
Crypto, okay, right, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of hard for me to measure like one form of government against another and say, oh yeah, that one's amazing and great, while that one's garbage, because kind of they're all fairly the same in a way that, and these votes that we have, you have 52% of people voting one way, and then everyone has to follow what they've said, which is basically the tyranny of the majority. If you manage to get one more vote than everyone else, then your say goes.
So what alarms you would be almost the fear of the majority, that because the majority of the EU superstate suddenly said you all have to, shag a lamppost every Tuesday.
Yeah.
Like, is that what drives the...
Well, the principle of self-determination, which we've talked about before in terms of like the situation in Scotland. I think the closer you can get to control of yourself and what's going on in your environment, the better.
There's definitely a few who truly believe that, but the vast bulk of people just hate foreigners. It would be good if we actually had it, if it was a proper political debate and people were weighing up this future questions, but it's not. It's very, there's the left-wing arguments for leaving the EU is pretty much all of that. They're terrified of this neoliberal juggernaut. But the problem with their arguments is that Britain hasn't been left-wing for decades, so you can't vote to leave when you're in a massive growing right-wing bubble. So anyone who's on the left that voted leave for that is a fucking idiot, if you ask me.
But you don't know which way it's going to go. I mean, if let's say Europe suddenly becomes more right-wing, which it seems like it actually might be happening. You get these kind of Austrian kind of right-wing guys doing well. Italy, the last election didn't look good for the left either. So what if the EU, in the next 10 years suddenly became a lot more right-wing? Would that change your mind a bit?
Well, no, it might do. Even at its core, the EU, they kind of promote austerity. Like, that's at their core. So, and the way they I don't actually know too much about it, but they basically slapped down the left-wing Greek government when they tried to go up against their bailout. They were just like, no, here's what you're doing. So that, in terms of democracy, that was a concern for everyone.
Yeah, one of my takes on it is like, why is it that, a choice like this should have such an impact on our lives as individuals? Why is it so important? Why should the majority of people be able to make decisions for us that will impact us and, not only stop us from doing the things that we want? Is there any way that we can get away from that and actually control our lives as individuals more? There's a guy called Samuel Edward Konkin III, which is a brilliant name, who came up with this idea called agorism. The agora was the marketplace in like ancient Greece, just like the centre of town, basically, where everyone would come and do all their stuff. So his idea was like actually, you can get engaged in politics, you can try and change stuff if you want. You can have these votes and referendums, do what you want, but you'll never really achieve exactly what you want because the majority will always rule over you. You'll always be able to choose, and you can spend your entire life campaigning for things and never achieve them. And I kind of can see that myself. Like, I could campaign for Scottish independence forever, and it might never happen. And that's kind of like a horrible thought, probably to folk who are like really, really into the Scottish independence thing, that you might die and it will never have happened.
I spoke to, maybe we shouldn't say it, but like Richard Walker, the guy who used to be the editor of The National and the Sunday Herald, said that he wanted NDRF2 as soon as possible because he wanted to live to see it.
That's part of the thing that, like Conkin's agorism idea was that, you can't rely on politics to change things. You should actually just go ahead and not seek permission for things. You just do them. You just get it done in your own terms. So his thing was counter economics. So he started talking about, like the black market already exists where no one asks permission to, do their prostitution service or sell drugs. They just do it. They don't pay any tax. They just do their own thing and they ignore the state. And that's kind of interesting thing. Like, we're talking about these debates about, the EU versus the UK versus independent Scotland and all this. What about if you could just make all these things completely irrelevant and just live the life that you want without actually asking any permission and just like create the situation that you want to live in? Which is hard because obviously none of these institutions want you to do that, but there's now starting to become ways that you can actually do that, through technology. You can opt out of the economic system by using Bitcoin. There's dark net markets where you can buy stuff that, they don't want you to buy. So this really appeals to me, this idea of just, not choosing between A or B on the political spectrum, just opting out of the entire thing, not voting, not joining a political party, just try to create the world that you want through these other mechanisms. And that, we're talking about like the distant future, obviously, in terms of like, well, we can't always have these stupid wee countries with their own wee governments. There's got to be a point where we just cooperate in a different way. And some people think that'll be like a world government or these great big institutions like the EU, but I tend to think, well, it's probably going to be the abolition of these things and we'll just be able to transact with each other on an individual level instead.
There, when we started this, I was like, I don't actually know anything about Brexit anymore because it's just kind of went on so long that I still follow it, but not as intensely as I did. And I was like, do I even know anything? I was like, well, yeah, nobody seems to know anything. So like, they just all seem to be sitting in these empty room with no folders. They're all just sitting at desks. Like, when I go to a meeting at work, I'm like, I better bring like my notepad just to look like I know what I'm talking about.
I mean, the only folk that are actually willing to admit they were fucking idiots and what we're calling about.
Is the way we should move forward this is just to do what's economically correct. Because what we've kind of concluded there that philosophically neither option really makes any sense.
Speaking selfishly for us, there's a good chance the economic impact of Brexit will consume our entire lives. We might never recover economically. That's how bad the forecast seems to be. Like Japan, I don't know if it was the Japanese companies or the ambassador basically presented, and they were saying this is an app they said we do not know why you're doing this. Our companies will stay here if it's profitable, but it probably won't be. And I think it said we regard this as, I think it might be an extreme self-harm or suicide. And I was like, it's really bad. I was like, if the Japanese are warning you about suicide, maybe you should. Well, that's it. I lived in Japan, I can say that. It's just like a naked banzai charge wrapped in a Union Jack.
I think what we found is that the philosophy of Brexit is horseshit. The only thing we have is economics. So we've now put all that philosophy to the side to do as best we can to get all this shit back that we voted out of.
The EU is like an aircraft carrier, right? and then there's this aging Spitfire on it, and we're allowed to stay there and fly off when we want. But now we're like, we want to live in the sky forever. And it's always like, oh, you can't land on this. And like, how would we pay you money to land on it? It's like, why don't you just stay here? They did, it's just like,
We'll refuel you. You can come in.
it's just the whole thing is like, it went full circle that now we're trying to opt into all the stuff that we had. Like, it's aside they're just committed to Brexit because they don't want to be embarrassed, even though we've embarrassed ourselves more than possible.
But how do you back out of it?
No Tory PM is ever going to see it. But what you would need would be like a Tory Prime Minister to go, listen, we've looked at it. It's probably going to be an absolute disaster. And then I would say, do you want a second referendum? There you go.
Well, they have done half of that. I mean, their own paper has said that leaving the single market at least will take 9% off GDP or will equal a 9% hit.
It's almost because it's went on so long. Only the people like us who care about it are reading that. Like the ones who voted leave are just like, has it happened yet? Are we out yet? And then the thing is, they're going to be so upset when we do eventually leave, and nothing in their life is going to change. If anything, it's going to get worse. We'll just be out the EU and everything will be worse.
Somehow it'll be the young people's fault because we didn't believe in their suicide enough.
Think about all those great jobs they'll be able to get now that all the immigrants were doing, like cleaning toilets and
Picking fruit.
yeah. Thank God we've got all our foot picking jobs back.
I know, and thank God we're all entering into a future where a robot or a machine might one day pick the fruit for us or clean the toilet for us, for that matter,
I think I'm a bit less pessimistic about it, the economic kind of side of it, It's kind of unknown, really. We don't really know what's going to happen. We know what it would be like if we went like Switzerland or Norway kind of route, which is not that bad. But I think the danger with it is that it's going to take time for people to adapt to that. Even if this does pan out, that it's good for us in the long term, there's going to be a big transition period where we're not used to that and we're not selling our strawberries to wherever, it's going to take a hit. And, what happens politically then when we have, 5, 10 years of a slump, and folk are like, this has not worked.
Especially off the back of basically a decade of recession and austerity. So you're just prolonging that. Everyone else is doing fine in Europe. And we're like, oh, we're our own country now.